hole. So our next group coming up, where is everybody? Okay, come on, Keith. Come on, Maya, get up here. So we're going to close on whether brands should be socially responsible. This suggestion kind of comes from for a panel comes from a column that our moderator here, Bryan Boettger of the Buddy Group, not Buddy Media, which doesn't exist anymore anyway. It's now Salesforce Marketing Cloud, and they were a sponsor of this event. But about whether brands in the social space have some sort of obligation or what have you, or a way of being sort of more socially responsible. And I think this goes deeper than a lot of the time brands sort of, hop on charities, so to speak. I hate to say it, but I think it's kind of true. We also have a scheduling or a personnel change for those of you keeping score. So Liz Shows is now on this panel, and Matt Blasco is in some of the information, is not. But Bryan also writes, as I said, he also co-writes the Social Media Insider for me, and he's been doing a great job, and his columns are much more practical than mine. So anyway, with that, Bryan, take it away. Thanks.
I don't know about this week. I did a rant on the Oreo thing after hearing so much about it this week.
Right,
so.
And I ranted too, different rants.
So thank you all for staying until the last panel. That's quite an endeavor. So thank you for all being here. First what we'll do is just do the introductions about who you are and what and who you represent, and then we'll dive in. So we've got some slides to help spur the conversation. I do have my iPad up here, which I've got TweetDeck on. So if you guys want to tweet out questions while we're going, I'll try to incorporate them in as we go. So we'll see if that results in more Twitter questions or less. So go ahead.
Hello, everybody. My name is Maya Greenberg, and I am here with Wildfire, which is a Google brand. At Wildfire, I am the chief evangelist, which is a really fantastic title they let me keep, and the social media manager. And what that means that I do is, on a daily basis, I am entrusted to be the voice of Wildfire. So it's actually me behind all of our social profiles, behind our blog, behind most of our content that we put out there. And then as chief evangelist, I get to take what I learn from doing that and communicate that to our audiences in an educational way, I hope. And that involves traveling around to places like this so that I can speak with fantastic people like you, and putting together monthly webinars, writing white papers and reports and things like that, reporting back to our audiences what works, what doesn't work, and how we learned that.
That's a cool title. I want to change mine. That's what works. I'm Keith Pape. I'm the Vice President of Social Media at Ayzenberg Group, a West Coast independent full-service agency. I run the social media practice. We have about 90 folks on the social media team. We manage about 50 million community members kind of on an ongoing basis. Everything from moderation, engagement, outreach, and analytics.
Liz Shows. I'm with Odyssey Marine Exploration. What we do is we're deep ocean exploration specialists. Most people know us for shipwreck exploration, and that's kind of the big excitement for our company. But we also do deep ocean mineral exploration, which is kind of a new venture. And I handle public relations, investor relations, and social media for the company.
Thanks. So do we have the slides to throw up there? So this is going to apply somewhat from what was talked about in the first panel this morning and some of what Joe was talking about. So we'll kind of do a little bit off of that. Let's see if this works. No.
So you can do two things at once.
There we go. Okay. So we're going to talk about different aspects of the responsibility in social media. So one of the things that we wanted to throw up there to kind of frame up the conversation a little bit was we went on and saw what the daily newspaper, number of daily newspapers and the number of circulation, and what the drop has been over the last 10 years and the last 20 years. And so part of the thought here is that, for a long time that we as brands in a lot of ways subsidize the news through our advertising. So as we move to more of the owned media instead of the paid media, is there any responsibility that goes with that? And these numbers kind of point directly to what we're talking about. So with that, especially when we look at newspapers, this stat said that 85 to 95% of original news stems from daily newspapers. So with the decline, a lot of original news is going to decline with it. So with that, kind of framing it up, as a responsibility standpoint for us to be watchdogs of ourselves, to hold ourselves to higher standards, to shed the light on our own industries, what responsibility do you think we have within the social media and digital space?
Well, I think that we, as brands, have a major responsibility to ourselves and to our customers and to prospects out there in the world to be on top of things. And what I mean by that is somebody's going to call you out, right? So we talked briefly about citizen journalism as we were preparing for this panel, and if your brand is doing something that previously would have gone kind of under the rug, swept under the rug, not a big deal, you're not being the most honest with your numbers, or you mark things down only to mark them right back up and call it a sale, or something like that. In this day and age where everybody whips out their phone to take a picture and immediately broadcast it, Tumblr or Twitter or Google Plus or Facebook or even LinkedIn or anything at all, you will be called out for it. So knowing what we know about how fast information spreads and how it can start from literally a nobody, not a huge news source, you're not being called out by a reporter, you're being called out by the guy who happened to sit next to you on the airplane and was watching your screen as you were working and read your entire, presentation before it was allowed to be public. This is why I have one of those magic screens that fuzzes everything out. I do think we have a major responsibility to ourselves, to our brands, and to the prospects that are reading our content out there to be ever so vigilant in the kind of information that we create and proliferate.
I think one of the things we were talking about in the prep was, in the last century or the end of the 19th, the way, whether it was manufacturing or whatever companies, they hid things, and it was the kind of the outcome of then of unions coming around. I think the internet now just kind of takes that place. It's self-policing. Everybody who works at every company has a phone with a camera on it. I think that like the power shift between the private citizen and unions and the government changes, I think the internet's doing the same thing for journalism. Citizen journalism and self-reporting has almost become a requirement, because if you get called out by one of these citizen journalists now, it makes it twice as bad as just a report in USA Today or the Wall Street Journal. I think the stakes are just higher.
So responsibility is almost a requirement or risk then? Like, if you don't do it, it's a risk, so it becomes a requirement?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what drives brands. I mean, because, brands is, especially public companies, their responsibility is to shareholders and make money, but they're also mitigating risk, which is why they invited VJ this week, so that way he could keep an eye on us and make sure we're following all those rules.
So what about, from your standpoint, I mean, you've got, we were talking earlier that there's the commercial side where you're making the money off of the shipwrecks and the, what you're basically lifting off the ocean floor, but then you also do a lot of education, right? So.
Yeah, and I think, right now we're in a world where anybody who has a computer can be a reporter almost, and they're not held to the same standards necessarily as journalists traditionally have been held to. So as soon as something's in print, a lot of people think it's fact, and we'll just mitigate that out there for their sources. We try to do a good job of putting as much information out there as possible so that people come to us for information and not to other unreliable sources.
So let's shift to the next little piece. Found this very ironic. So this is a clothing retailer out of the New York area whose tagline was, "An educated consumer is our best consumer." This company that was around for 20 years went out of business in 2011. So either they failed at education or they were wrong. But the question that we wanted to ask the panel was, is an educated consumer really a better consumer? Like, to what extent does educating the consumer about your industry, about your product, make sales better, or do you think it's just something you have to do, but it makes selling more difficult?
I think an educated consumer can be one of your better consumers, but I understand the perspective that an educated consumer might be seen as more of a risk, because you're more at a risk to lose that consumer because he knows so much about you. He knows about your competitors. He knows, what you should be selling at, the prices, and he knows what he can be getting on the market, and he knows to walk away from you when it's time, which is probably what happened to Sims, because there's myriad other fashion retail outlets that sell the same clothes for the same prices or less, right? So we have to take that into account. But in terms of an educated consumer being a powerful tool, I think at this point, consumers have information everywhere. It's all around them. And when they want to get educated about your brand and they want to learn something, let's say they're on a purchase, they're at the very beginning of their purchase journey, and they are wanting to buy a camera, and between point A and point Z, where they've actually purchased this camera, there's a million touch points that they have. And the most interesting part is that those touch points are no longer with your brand, right? So they're not going to start on the Canon website necessarily. They're probably going to start by asking their friends, I'm really interested in a digital camera. Can you make a recommendation? They might go to Facebook and ask Facebook. They might search through digital camera aficionado forums, and they might be reading blog posts written by, a citizen journalist blogger who writes about all sorts of things, but is also pretty well known for taking good pictures, even though he's an amateur. And along the way, he becomes a super educated customer, and he never had to interact with your brand, let's say your Canon, at all. So you'd better hope, as Canon, that the information that he's receiving out there from the rest of the world and his friends and all those social networks is the right kind of information that sells Canon as the best possible brand to buy that digital camera from. So we go back to that very first question, where it's your responsibility to educate, to put information out there that says, here's the right kind of lens for shooting in this kind of light. Not necessarily selling Canon, but selling information that's really valuable and relevant for your consumer, and educating them to the point where they feel that you're looking out for them. And Canon gets into that conversation.
So the old miracle on 34th Street, like, if Santa is telling them where to go correctly, they'll want to come to Macy's, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big things that's changed is like you're saying, if you're not taking a leadership position in your industry on the information, somebody else will. And that information might be wrong, it might be more accurate to another product. The world's changed in how information is consumed, so you have a responsibility to participate in your industry, whereas, like in the Mad Men days, it was all about shaping your product for the 30-second spot to make sure that your product was put in the best light. There was no industry consideration at all. Now it's completely flipped because the information is available, and the information will be wrong if you don't participate, or if you don't participate, your competitors will. So that once again, I think the chicken and the egg, that the entire ecosystem has changed, and so the way companies have to operate is just, they have a responsibility on another level just to be successful. And I think like the clothing company, sometimes what happens is you may participate correctly in the industry, but you still have to have great product. And so there's no room anymore for one-way push-only advertising that allows you to sell a lot of a bad product. That usually gets exposed really quickly in this environment.
So you guys educate your consumers. How does it help you? Does it?
I think, in terms of, we're not necessarily working directly with consumers in the traditional sense like you guys are talking, but people we work with, partners, we want them to be as educated about our work as possible. And we do that. We have an exhibit that travels around the United States. We have a virtual museum that's accessible to anybody around the world. And we do television documentaries, so people can see what we're about, how we work, and know that we're the world leaders and we're experts in what we do. So it's absolutely necessary for us to share and
So
educate.
It does help your bottom line as well as being in some ways, philanthropical effort as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so shifting the responsibility questions a little bit. This one's a little interesting. It basically says that 74% of consumers expect a response within 60 minutes on social media. I'll say that's mildly ridiculous, but that's out there, so that's what consumers are expecting. So we're all out there, a lot of us are out there on Facebook and Google Plus and Twitter and all these places with all these consumers out there that call out the brands, either thanking them, asking questions. If we're going to go ahead and put ourselves out there, like Tumblr, put ourselves out there, do we have a responsibility to dialogue with consumers to answer their questions? And if so, what's your opinion on the response rate that we have to do?
I think that the response rate question is a very popular one, and that each company at that organizational level needs to consider their social, master service agreement or service level agreement, what they agree within the organization, and kind of commit to consumers to respond with or respond at, or what they're going to respond to. And you'll see this sometimes on certain corporate social profiles, certain ones, for example, like Time Warner Cable. If you go to their Facebook page, they do have a tab that's called, something like Our Agreement to You, and then if you go click through to that tab, you can read what they say. They will respond to certain posts like this. They will try to do their best to respond to most customers. They won't respond to posts that do this, this, or that, right? And don't expect a response if you're doing this. So they kind of very clearly lay it out there, their agreement to you, their consumer, what they will engage with you with and what they won't, which puts it in very clear terms what this consumer is entitled to expect from you. But I don't think that should be, that commitment needs to be the same across companies. So for example, Lady Gaga or any celebrity will have millions upon millions of followers, and they're constantly chattering and trying to make contact, and there's no reasonable way that they can respond, right? Lady Gaga's PR people, or even if we bring it back down to the brand level, a P&G brand like Tide has millions and millions of people making comments, but is it reasonable to expect that every single one of those millions of comments will be responded to and within an hour? No. But at a brand level like P&G's, I would expect their PR teams to come together and agree to what they're going to respond to, when, how long it will take, and define kind of those boundaries, because consumers are so empowered nowadays with the possibilities of social media, and they're getting a little bit entitled. And so I think managing expectations is a very solid strategy that brands maybe haven't considered yet, is that why don't we go ahead and tell you how we're going to be able to respond to you, how we're committing to you, so that you don't make these types of assumptions and upset yourself.
So you think that what Time Warner is doing, that's a best practice that a lot of us should be doing?
I think it's a very strong practice. I think it puts it all out there, and it's a commitment that they cannot back away from. So they leave no room for assumptions. And again, the other side of that token is that if they don't fulfill that agreement, if they don't respond to the type of commentary they said they would, or within the amount of time that they had committed to, that leaves room for the consumer to be like, well, you said you would, and that's bad PR too. So very clearly lays out an agreement between the consumer and the brand that I think is a very interesting way to manage that type of communication.
So I assume a lot of your agency growth is fueled by this as well, all the monitoring and maintenance?
That's why you're wrong, absolutely.
What's that?
You are incorrect, sir.
Oh, really?
Not that that's what fueling the growth, but the idea that it's a bad, that 60 minutes is unreasonable. I'm sure there are people that when the telegraph was the hot new technology said, telephones, dial tone. No, absolutely not. I'd much rather go down to the general store and set up my telegraph and send it off, and a couple hours later hear back and have to run back down there. It's ridiculous. We are an always-on society. That's not going to change. Customer service has always been expected to go and respond immediately. If the phone lines back up, I think you're right, Comcast Cares was definitely the poster child for a long time for showing how social media can be an always-on opportunity. You know, it was 20 years ago, it was the big call center. 10 years ago, it was, I mean, in the tech platform area in Silicon Valley, there were 1 million live chat programs going on that Amazon and everybody was trying to figure out as you could, you know, live chat, you know, basically IM with a customer service person. Social media is just the next step of that. But I think you're right. Every product's different, so not everybody needs the same thing, but in call center parlance, it's, you know, it's a service level agreement, or we call it KPIs in marketing, you know, and as long as it's clearly pointed out, you know, and it's relevant to the product that you're selling, it makes sense. Comcast is selling a always-on service. It's a cable network. If there's an outage, or if somebody has an outage, they have a responsibility to be there to respond to those things. And that's, I think, what they point out, is they point out, if you have these kind of questions which are related to service, they're going to respond to that very quickly. And you're right, in the industry I work in mostly, which is entertainment and video games, 5 years ago, it wasn't a requirement. Now most video games are persistent online activities. And the idea of somebody, you know, paying $60 for something and not being able to play, it's unreasonable to wait an hour. You know, you've paid for a level of expectation because they've now forced video games to be online. There's no more, what they call it, couch co-op, where you and your buddy sit next to each other with 2 controllers. Very few games have that now. There's a required online component. If you're going to require that, you need to step up, and you need to be, you know, have people on all the channels, whether that's social or voice or whatever. So there's brands are creating products that require an always-on technology.
So you have a pretty big team that's grown a lot over the last few years. What do you think is the split between how much of your team is developing kind of editorial calendar, like pre-planned content for your clients, versus how much of your team is doing more of response marketing?
Oh, it's definitely, response takes a lot of time and effort. So it's definitely 70% of the team is dealing with response. You know, like you're talking about, when you have millions and millions of community members, it takes a lot of bodies to get out there. And I agree with you. Lady Gaga doesn't need, you know, a team like ours or like Dell's, you know, social media center to respond immediately. She doesn't have an always-on requirement. That's for entertainment purposes only. It's a personality. You know, Dell and Comcast, and even potentially a Ford as well, where they're selling a service and their product is expected to work all the time. That's where it makes sense that you're going to have to apply humans to, because certainly we see that applying tech automation like bots and responses does nothing but really make the trolls angry.
So how does this apply to your business?
We have a really small communications team, but we try to answer all questions within 2 business days. And I mean, on average, on a regular week, I'll have about 50 questions from the public or media or investors. But during a big announcement, that can go to about 100 questions a day. So it kind of makes it hard to manage for 1 or 2 people to do that, but I think it helps, going back to the concept as brands as publishers, we have the information out there, so it's a matter of locating it, quickly sending it to them. So it's really helpful for us.
I think that's a good point. You mentioned like P&G. Most of the time they don't need something, but I think as a brand they need to be prepared, you know, contingency plans. Well, if there's a recall, if something goes on, then all of a sudden they do have a responsibility to respond immediately. And that's part of, you know, disaster recovery planning, contingency planning. That's normal, should be, you know, corporate planning process.
Do you scale up during those times? Like, do you bring in contractors and whatnot?
We have contractors that we work with, but we don't bring on extra personnel to handle it, just for big announcements.
Okay, so we've kind of touched on this a little bit. I mean, you mentioned like gaming companies versus P&G and like all that. Are there different rules? You know, like we're all playing as brands as publishers, but
Sorry about that.
Do you feel that different industries or different companies or size of companies have different rules? We were talking about how, you know, one might expect that some would, but then like maybe someone who sells shoes shouldn't, but then there's like Tom's Shoes who is highly engaged on a responsibility standpoint.
Right. So when we were prepping for this particular question, the example came up of Tom's Shoes, which is 1 for 1, and then Warby Parker, which sells eyeglasses, and you buy 1 pair of eyeglasses and they give away 1 pair of eyeglasses. And so is it reasonable to expect that brands of the new age do this 1 for 1 type of thing, or be all so good that they have to match what they're making with what they donate? And I don't think that they have to do that. I don't think that in order to be a good, well-respected brand within a community, or when you're thinking about your social good or your corporate social responsibility, you necessarily have to do 1 for 1. There are ways that you can be responsible and good and give back to your community as a small mom and pop shop, just like Tom's is able to as, at this point, a global brand. So I do think there are different rules for different people, and I also don't think that they're rules. So there's nothing saying that you have to have this certain level of commitment of your bottom line in order to be considered a player in the industry, or in order to get some award for being socially responsible as a brand or as a community brick and mortar shop. So I think it's very reasonable for the brand to consider its own values and what it commits to, its mission statement, those things that all companies have to write, but really consider what the mission statement is, to understand what its own rules will be for how it will engage with the community. Google, for example, is well known for, during times of great crisis or need, like Hurricane Sandy and the uprisings in the Middle East, to commit certain services that are very important and very necessary. Twitter also committed to providing a private line for Twitter communication during the uprisings in, I want to say, Libya, or sometime last year, committed a private line to make sure that citizens in those war or protest areas were able to communicate with the outside world, despite what was happening with their government within that region. They didn't have access, right? So it's not a rule that Twitter has to provide this around the world when it's needed. It's a values thing. What does Twitter as a company value? Freedom of information, and so on and so forth. Therefore, they committed that kind of service. Google values very much the same thing. So they opened up all sorts of programs for people in power outage areas to know where they can go to get supplies and get help, and so on and so forth. So it's very much down to the organization, down to your values as a company, and there are no rules.
It really gets down to the relevance and authenticity to their DNA. It becomes more about what's part of their culture. Because it's not about one-to-one, it's about what makes sense to either their style of management or their style of product. It's finding something that's authentic to them and sticking to it. Because if it's something that you're doing, to just one-up somebody else, you won't be able to stick with it. It'll fall by the wayside, and that'll just make you look worse. You have to do something that really sticks with your entire culture, and that can be forever.
Yeah, and I think, like Keith said, it's part of our culture of exploration that we want to share as much as we can with the general public. We're out there doing things that nobody's ever done before, and discovering things and learning things about the deep ocean. So it's just a natural extension for us to take that and share it with the general public as much as possible.
So lastly, what gets you excited? So when we talk about responsibility, and it sounds like kind of the general theme is that it's both a necessary good, right? Not necessarily evil, but a necessary good, and it's also an opportunity for brands. So around it, whether it's education or cause marketing or whatever it might be, what gets you all excited? Maybe we'll start at that end, work down.
It gets me excited because we share so much of what we do. When I post something on Facebook, such as an artifact, and I'll put just a little bit of history behind that artifact, those are the posts that get the most shares. I mean, we'll get sometimes up to 100 shares, 20 comments, 30 comments, a lot of interaction. People get excited, and then that in turn gets me excited to see people so excited about what we're doing and what we're learning.
For me, my relevance comes around, I think, probably because I have kids, is anything to do with children. And it's really, I find it really passionate when, it's funny, since I work with a lot of violent video games, that those are when I find companies that are doing something like Sanuk, the shoe company. They've got really big, they kind of discovered, and this is just kind of stories that I read, it was, as they were traveling the world and doing all these really cool things, that was kind of part of their DNA of trying, they surf in Antarctica. Like, okay, that's nothing to do with shoes, but for them, it's part of their really cool, beach surfer mentality. That was kind of why they took flip-flops and covered them to keep their feet warm, which then caused them to travel the world and then discover these, these children with cleft palate and these different things, and they found something they were passionate about. So all of a sudden, it's like, it's a brand that I want to watch. It's a brand that I want to participate in. How can I help them do better? It's like, we're all in business, and I think unlike our parents and generations before, where you worked in the factory, you got there at 9 o'clock, you clocked in, you clocked out, we're all on 24 hours a day. So if we have to be out there making money, and we have to be out there working, it's like, find something that fits into your passion, that then just gives it that little something extra, so when you're out there every day, you're doing some good. And so for me, that kind of what helps drive me in like my current kind of train of thought is, I've been really enjoying LinkedIn's new program with influencers, and it's got me a chance to go beyond like reading a little bit about Richard Branson and how Virgin takes Virgin Unite and the Elders programs, and they just find ways that are relevant to each of their sub-brands, and always find something that is in their DNA to give back. Whether it's their transportation industry, it's about discovering biofuels, it's about all their businesses in Africa, making sure that every employee gets AIDS medication, because it's such a huge problem in that region. They find things that are relevant to caring for their people. It makes going to work every day a little better.
I actually am excited and get a little geeky about just technology as it relates to social media. So I realize I may be among the minority when I say I really like new tech that makes my interactions with brands seem much more relevant and more actually in tune with what I'm interested in, what I want to see and what I want to hear. So for example, a technology that is prevalent today that I quite enjoy, which can sometimes be frustrating to my wallet, is retargeting. So, when you're just looking around and you're just looking at fine jewelry on a certain website and you're liking what you see and it's fantastic, but at the moment you don't really want to pony up, $700 for a pretty bauble. But then everything you do for the next 2 weeks, every website that you visit, every publication that you read the news at, every social network, you see what you were looking at. You see that bracelet following you around and reminds you of how beautiful it was and how nice it will look on your wrist. I actually kind of really enjoy that. It makes me feel as though these interactions are personalized. It's no longer me looking at ads for things that have nothing to do with my life. It's me looking at ads for things that have everything to do with my life and reminding me that I was meaning to do this and that I should buy that and that I need to get educated about this and that thing. And so I'm actually really excited about the potential for brands being able to connect to me on a more personal level, that every brand that I interact with should know that I'm mid-20s female, that I live on the West Coast of the United States, that I am in the technology sector, that I'm interested in this and that thing, so that they can begin to cater their communications to me and make me feel like I'm an important part of their, prospective clientele. And that is what gets me excited, dorky as it may be. And also the jewelry, of course, but, that's not the subject of this conversation.
I'm going to step away from moderator real quick and say, discussing this and getting ready for it, I think there's two things that make great advertising. One is enacting passion within your consumers, and the other is doing education of your consumers. And I think great advertising happens from really doing that. And we so often go down the road of passion and trying to get the passion points. But like if we do the education right, like whether it's long form or short form or a headline, like being able to educate, and this might be because before I was in advertising, I was a journalist. So like there's that side of my personality, but like that excites me. Like I love the fact that we can take the research that these brands are doing and easily get it out to consumers and educate them where they might not have that education otherwise, which is kind of a fun thing. Okay, so questions? Anyone?
Do we have questions? Okay. Are you ready for my question, Bryan? So getting back to the all customer service thing, I find it really interesting how uneven the performance of brands is on different platforms, and I wondered if you guys had thoughts into that. I mean, I hope I'm not repeating myself. You know, if you guys read my column, I recently went on about Best Buy and the Geek Squad, and they didn't show up when they're supposed to, and you know, did the phone channel, also did the Twitter channel, and the phone channel was completely clueless, and the Twitter channel was like on it, and you know, like within 10 minutes after I got the email of the social squad within the Geek Squad, they called me and said, we're on our way, like I was having a heart attack or something, you know. I was really like befuddled by why there's this like channel disconnect. It's crazy, you know. And it's not that that's a particularly pointed example, but you see it, you know, we all see it.
I think it's really fascinating that the brands respond in this way. We expect it to be a standard that you pay attention to each channel in the same way. But frankly, it's logical to assume that they're scared. They're so scared of what's going to happen if you are a negative consumer on Twitter, and that chances are, let's put a few things in perspective. So the people who are manning that channel are most likely trained in a very different way than the people who are manning the phones, right? So the phones might be outsourced, they might be in a different country, they may be trained only to answer product-specific technical questions.
They have a flow chart that they have
right,
to
exactly. One goes to the other, goes to the other. On Twitter, maybe you have someone in PR, someone who's smart enough to look through your Twitter handles, see what your name is, see that you're a reporter.
I'd love to know. I mean, I'm not, you know, I'm sure there are people in this room who have more followers than I do, but you know, it's a 4-digit number, you know, and I'm like, okay, I don't want it to be about that. It shouldn't be about that.
I don't think it's about your. Yeah. It's not about you. They're looking up your Twitter background and responding. I think what we're talking about is the fact that the people who are operating Twitter are a much different type of person. The education level, the job responsibilities of somebody running Twitter and Facebook are completely different. In most Fortune 500s, I mean, in almost every client I work with, the hiring scheme for a customer service person on the phone is completely different than the people who respond on Facebook and Twitter. I mean, you've got people on. The person on Facebook and Twitter probably had a master's degree. You know, it's not literal, but I mean, really, that's the difference where the person on that answers the phone is probably making $12 an hour and like it might be in a different country. There's a disparity on a understanding of the levels of customer service across the different channels right now in most of the corporate brands.
Yeah, I mean, it just was a really pointed example to me, as I was saying before. So, you know, because I don't know what I think of that brand now. Good, bad, no, really good.
Which is just going to force more people to the social channels. Yeah. If the quality of the response is better, it drives people there, which then gets back to our first question of then you have to respond faster. Yeah. Which is, of course, going to drive up costs because you have to maintain that same level of education and response and yet provide customer service.
It becomes a new standard, and people read about it more, and people read articles like yours and figure out that when they have a real problem, real issue, this is where they go. And so
I knew about the Geek Squad Twitter effectiveness from reading other people's articles.
Exactly.
You know, so.
And it worked, which is self-perpetuating. It's really, really fascinating. I actually take it to the other extreme. Being on the receiving end of communications towards our brand, I get that sometimes it hurts. It just hurts when somebody is having an unhappy experience. Not that that happens often, but once in a blue moon, somebody will have an unhappy experience and tweet at Wildfire about it. I will see it, and I know how that feels. And so I actually will also go to the opposite extreme. And when I'm really happy with a brand, I make sure that I have that brand know it. So I recently had a fantastic experience with Visa Concierge Services where I asked them to do something for me, and they did it, and it was amazing. I went immediately to Twitter, told them how fantastic their service was, and felt gratified when somebody got back to me immediately and said, thanks for sharing that positive feedback.
Yeah, and I had that with Geek Squad as well, actually. Yeah.
I have a friend that owns a couple restaurants, and so he's very in tune with the hospitality industry, and he has this rule that if something goes wrong, he knows as a restaurant owner he would want to know about it. So he's very willing to let people know when something goes wrong. But his rule is that for every time he tells someone something negative, he has to make sure that he finds another positive experience he's had, whether it's somewhere else or whatever, and communicates that out, so it's a 1-to-1 ratio. I want to put Joe on the spot because he wrote an article asking, are we really going to go there? The question about our consumers, our educated consumers, better consumers, and I'm not sure what you meant by that question. So, see, I'm on top of it. I'm reading your articles while we're doing this.
That's really good. Well, what I meant is, if you believe, it's like P.T. Barnum, you can fool anybody anytime, or you can never cheat an honest man. I mean, it's just a very low bar for the advertising, media, and digital communications industry to set. If it's not about, educated consumers, what are we, hoodwinking people? I mean, what's the point?
Well, I guess the question was, going back to that idea of you can entertain consumers, you can enact their passion points. There's different things you can do to win over consumers, education being just one of them.
Okay.
And so, to what level is education a requirement?
Well, the Sims copy line really meant if you were smart, you would buy from us because there were good values and it was reasonable cost. So I just think it was about the context of the quote. Also, I don't think they went out of business because they had stupid consumers.
Right.
Okay, do we have it? Okay. Oh, we got 2 questions here. Remember name, title, social security number, please. Thank you.
My name's Ken Roman. I'm with an agency side. And I guess my question is, I don't even know if it's a question or just a postulation. I get annoyed, or I'm concerned that we're sensitizing consumers just to use social media as an outlet for, and you've already touched on it a little bit, complaining. I, like most of us that do these things regularly, am an elite status with hotels and airlines, and it annoys me when, I'm going to go by name, Delta, crown room attendant, gate agent, nobody else can do anything for me after 3 or 4 flight cancellations and delays, and yet I put one tweet on Delta Cares, and immediately I'm booked on a flight and I've got a flight credit.
Don't you think eventually that will circle back and through their back channel and cause them to hopefully then do better training for their live people, because there'll be that back pressure that why is social having to deal with this? Why isn't your team handling it? Those are certainly some of the back channel conversations I hear at clients when social starts outperforming real life or voice channels. There becomes a lot of politics going on, saying, well, why is this getting to the social channel? Why aren't your people handling this?
I don't think it'll ever hit that same level though, because you treat it. It's not right, but just as humans, we treat people different in public than we do in private.
So you should be treating them better?
I think
you have to look them in the eye?
It's different. It's also different in a smaller, nimble company than it is in a Delta or Marriott or what have you. My question is, if you're a loyal, or even if you're not a loyal, if you're standing there in person, why wouldn't you get somebody to respond to a traveler in distress versus it has to go on Twitter, which is
If we were to make an analogy, I think the most applicable analogy might be you have a customer support issue and you usually get the first level to possibly help you with it, and if that doesn't work, you ask to speak to the manager, and if that doesn't work, you ask to speak to the supervisor. At this point in time, going to Twitter and getting responses seems to be like going straight to the supervisor or going straight to the people who can actually make a difference and help you, especially in a pretty serious situation like getting you rebooked on another flight. So that first line of service, those people on the ground may just actually be powerless in that capacity to make the decisions that they need to make in order to be able to reservice you. They know, again, the flow chart system, like what they're allowed to do and what level they're allowed to accommodate you to. And I absolutely understand your question. I hope that the only way that you can get help is not just by going to social, but it'll take some time. It'll take some resources management. It'll take the Deltas of the world to get, at those board tables and look at how many complaints there were placed via Twitter, via Facebook, via Google+, and how many positive experiences and how those surveys turned out to actually reformat the organization. I think the problem, not the problem, but the issue is that nobody is quite sure yet the impact of social on the service industry. They're seeing how it works, but we haven't had enough time to really restructure our organizations, and that's why it's like a big topic. There's an analyst firm out of Silicon Valley called Altimeter Group, and one of their key areas of focus is how to organize within your company around social media. How many people do you need? What do they do? What level should they be? How senior? What kind of training? What kind of education should they have in order to be able to accommodate your company's social media needs? And they're studying that now. So I think getting that out into the industry for companies like Delta to adopt might take a little while.
And don't get me wrong, I think that should be the standard. I'm not saying we shouldn't have that standard, but I think it's gonna naturally, economically have to change as more people go to social media for these responses. Because if you look at it, I'm sure if there's major storms, take all the blizzards and everything, right? The airline industry probably has, a ton of people calling the phone number. They probably have a ton of people at the airport pissed off. But then they have a handful of people on Twitter. So it's really easy for me to throw some support to 5 people versus having to do the same standard across all the phone lines.
Oh, it's sad. So we're going to do one last very quick question because we're running over. So be quick, Jeff, and you guys be quick too.
Comment and quick question. Comment was, I think it's right along the line with what you're all talking about. I think it was interesting last night before going to bed, I watched a documentary showing that companies like McDonald's and Carl's Jr. were outsourcing literally the most intimate part, which was the order process of the drive-through, to an external company and hiring smart folks to do that. And I thought that was fascinating to watch. It kind of falls in line with your point around the airlines had the exact same experience. But I think, I don't know if anyone from Bank of America was still here, but I think at the end of the day, if I've got $1 million holder, a $100,000 account holder, and a $100 account holder, you treat them differently. And I think that through the social media connection, Twitter probably being the first line of response from a way to attack them, is that you can have that one-on-one experience, which ultimately I think all brands want to get to. My question is do brands feel comfortable losing control, if you will, outsourcing that intimate component to a third party to do?
Okay, you have 30 seconds.
I think for us, because what we do is so complicated and it's hard to understand and it's not something easily understood by somebody on the outside or an agency, we have to keep it internal.
I think that to date, a lot of brands have felt comfortable outsourcing the social component of their marketing needs, but as time goes on, and now especially, they're beginning to realize that social needs to be brought in-house, that it's as important, your voice, your tone, your attitude, and your responses, as important on social as it is with every single other marketing channel that you've had to date. So it's a huge risk to outsource that. And we see that time and time again in PR marketing debacles, like, when I think it was Kenneth Cole had a Twitter tweet about their awesome new fall line, but they piggybacked on a hashtag that was about, the uprisings in Egypt. So the PR person who was doing that outsourced person outside of the organization, had no idea what was actually going on in the news and made a fool of that particular brand. And that's a huge risk that more and more.
I don't know that that being in the brand would have solved that problem, though. That person's just an idiot.
Well,
Like,
in general.
but I do agree. Like our agency, like for a couple years now, we've recommended to all our clients that we do the strategy. We do it for the first few months. We build an editorial calendar, but our default recommendation is they take it on in-house. And if they can't, then we support them or we hire basically an employee for them to do it.
Yeah,
So-
we do the
Okay,
same
but
thing.
yeah.
I think
Sorry, we do have to
Everyone's-
wrap up. I'm sorry to hate cutting
Everyone's
people off.
skipping the roundtables anyways to catch their taxis.
Oh, now. You're a moderator of a roundtable. You should like that. So Keith, you have 10 seconds.
I agree. I don't think agencies should own the voice. You know, we're happy to be the fingers and the toes and the help, but you've got to own your own brand voice and have somebody that's ultimately responsible for us to work with, because you'll know your brand better than we do.
Well, you know what? People finally agree with me on that. That always bugged me. So if you're able, give these guys like a standing ovation because they're like the last panel. Come on! Yay! But obviously, people were kind of interested in that discussion. So before we break into roundtables, for those of you not taking cabs, I just wanted to say thank you to like all these media post people. Ken, yes, Ken, I'm saying thank you to you. Oh, he's got his signs. He doesn't need a thank you. To Rob in the back, AB, thank you, Rob. Thank you, John Whitfield. Liam and John Ronga are somewhere around here. I'll thank Joe Mandisi just for existing. He's giving me a peace sign, and also to Emily Orsini who helped out and sent out all those awesome emails. But really, it takes a village to run a summit, and so that's what we're doing.
And thank you to Kathy Taylor for an awesome program and her team of smart people.
Yeah, see, once again, we just say this joke every time the check cleared, right? Okay, thank you. Okay, so our
sponsors?
No, you're the sponsor guy. Oh yeah.
Do that? Okay. Hey, thanks, sponsors.
Okay. See, we have a very strict church and state policy here at Media Post. You guys don't have to sit up here anymore, by the way. Okay. So our let's see. Oh, our roundtables. Do we have? Oh, thank you for putting that up there, Rob. So developing your native advertising strategy. That's right here. Ken Roman is the moderator of that. I thought it should be develop your native advertising strategy if you dare. Then we have, does my brand need to be socially responsible? That is our good friend Brian Boettger from Buddy Group again. And looking beyond Facebook and Twitter to market and social, and that's Ava Schmeidleitner. I hope I said your name right, Ava, from the Austrian Tourist Office. So thanks, guys.